We have Mara Rudman, Assistant Administrator, Middle East Bureau at USAID. Thank you, Mara, for coming. We have Alanoud Al Sharekh, Senior Fellow for Regional Politics, IISS-Middle East, who's with us via video conference. She's in the Gulf today. Hi, Alanoud, how are you doing?
Hello, hi.
Thanks for joining us on the later side in the Gulf. And finally, we have Tariq M. Yusuf, Chief Executive Officer of Silatech, Qatar, and Chairman of the World Economic Forum Global Agenda Council on the Arab World. Tariq joins us. He came here from Doha today, so a special thanks very much for making the trip. Just a few comments to set the scene before I invite our speakers to begin. The events of the Arab world of the past 2 years have brought to light many of the socioeconomic challenges facing that region. Perhaps foremost is the sticky issue of youth unemployment and the failure of state-led economies to respond to this challenge. This challenge has widely been considered to be one of the key drivers of almost 2 years of regional upheaval. As noted in the World Economic Forum Arab World Competitiveness Report last year, youth unemployment scope for those between 15 and 24 averages 25% across the region, which is far in excess of the 17% youth unemployment rate which characterizes OECD countries. In some Arab countries, in fact, youth unemployment exceeds over 30%. To provide us with a greater context over this challenge and some of the key programs and policy reforms currently underway, I'm going to now invite our 3 speakers to each deliver some remarks, after which we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers from the audience. And I'd just like to remind everybody that this is on the record. We're being live streamed. And when I do turn to the audience, if you could please state your name and affiliation before directing your question. So without further ado, I'm going to first invite Mara Rudman here to begin. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt, very much, and thank you to IISS for inviting me and talk about this critical issue. I also very much appreciate the chance to be here with my fellow panelists, because it's so important for us at USAID and throughout the government to be able to hear and benefit from the important analysis and work that's being done outside of the government. What I want to be able to talk to you about today, and I'll be brief because I look forward to I'll try to be brief. I look forward to the questions and answers, questions that we'll get as we, after we all finish with our comments. But I want to be able to talk to you a little bit about some of the specific programmatic work that we have been doing throughout the region. Not just in the last couple of years, obviously, but well before that. But I also want to be able to give you some of the very specific examples that have come up for me in some of my travels through the region in the most immediate period. And the most immediate example that comes to mind, and what I'd like to start off with, is a meeting I had about a little less than a year ago now. In fact, it was last January. And it was a young man that I met with in Tunis. He wasn't from Tunis, he was from Kasserine City. His name is Ali Boyadi. And in fact, he was from Kasserine City, which, as many of you know, is one of the most marginalized areas in Tunisia. Suffers from very high unemployment. I dare say it's probably higher than the average of 25% that you mentioned. It was certainly a flashpoint during the revolution. More than 20 people were killed there, hundreds were injured in just one day in January of 2011 there. And Ali stands out for a number of reasons. I was meeting on that particular day with, in a roundtable discussion with about 5 or 6 people who had gotten various small grants from USAID, some in the economic area, some in civil society types of help. They were from all over Tunisia, but I will say that more of them were from Tunis, fewer from inner Tunisia. Ali was the last to speak. He was considerably younger than the others at the table, and he was from, on average, more economically disadvantaged than others. He was he was notably quieter. Others had been interjecting more when everyone else at the table was speaking. He had kept his own counsel. And I would say that others in the discussion were doing a lot more notable complaining about about a number of things that had been going on in Tunisia over the immediate period of time. Not that there wasn't, without commentary on what there was or wasn't to complain about with respect to what was going on in Tunisian politics, but there was a fair amount of discontent voiced at the table. Ali, when he started speaking, first thanked USAID for the grant that they had provided to him and his community, and caught my attention right away because he congratulated us on our 50th anniversary, which had been that year, and noted that, reminded me that President Kennedy had started the organization, launched it. It was actually the first time in my travels, on that particular trip certainly, that anyone had acknowledged President Kennedy's start of USAID. To me, so it was interesting to me that he had done that. And then proceeded to, in a very quiet voice, note to the rest of the table, kind of reminding the rest of the table that in fact it had been President Kennedy that had noted to Americans that they should ask not what their country should do for them, but what they should do for their country. He said it very quietly, and I got the feeling he was saying it not just me, but to his colleagues at the table. He caught their attention right away, as he caught mine too. And then he proceeded to talk about why he thought that the kinds of grants that AID had provided to his community were so useful. And in his case, they were small level community grants that he and his community had used to do various types of banding together, types of efforts to do what started as neighborhood cleanup and repainting and that types of work, but ended up doing much more kind of leveraging of community activism, frankly, and moved into various other types of projects where they would come to us and come up with various ideas for things that they felt the community needed. And we would be able to, depending on what the proposal was, go back and provide them with more assistance. And the most recent thing he was going back to do was provide broader tutorial programs for his community, for younger kids in the community, because so many of the parents in that community were working and were not able to provide for younger kids, and for helping those kids to go off and do better in school, because we realized how critical education was to being able to go off into the job market and to look for jobs and employment from there. And so in so many ways, I start with this story because it symbolizes to me the number of different links in our assistance, that we look not just for specific economic assistance, but for the people to be able to help, the ways in which our programs are linked in many different ways, who to help, communities to help, people to find sort of motivating factors in those communities for other folks, and the challenges that various communities face across these regions. I would say that in the recent period of time, in the last couple of years, USAID has supported countries across the region, certainly in political reforms. They write new constitutions and reform institutions as they carry out free and fair elections, and as they work in a number of these countries to bring citizens into the political process. But we're working equally to try to deal with these key economic frustrations that are at the heart of a lot of what was the initial spark, for example, in Tunisia, and what forced the revolution there, the frustrations that moved young people across the region to protest in the streets, and the challenges in terms of the economic situation that still exists, and it takes such a long period in so many instances to change, to bring about change. Youth make up at least 30% of the population in the Middle East and North Africa, and as we commented, their rate of unemployment is high. It's at least 24–25% on average, and in many of the countries we're working in, that number is significantly higher, and it's certainly higher than that of young people anywhere else in the world. So with the political changes that these young people helped to usher in across the region came very high expectations that their economic challenges would be addressed and their personal situations would improve. And that is part of what we're dealing with as we work to help in these individual countries. Because building strong economies that cut red tape, that encourage entrepreneurism, that create new jobs, as we know here in the United States, is not necessarily a really fast process. It takes time. And working on the political side as well, on developing good governance processes and building capacity, is also generally not a fast process. And matching that up with expectations is a tremendous challenge in each of these countries. And so we work with our programs. We've committed, just in fiscal year 2012 alone, more than $1.6 billion across the region for development assistance. And that assistance is largely focused on these various issues. It's both on the political side and on the economic side and on integrating our work, focusing on programs that target the educational mismatch between what young people are studying, the skills necessary in the economy, helping to train them in soft skills like critical thinking or writing a resume, needed in the global economy, working to encourage entrepreneurism and job growth, and doing it as effectively as we can, as quickly as we can, and as thoughtfully as we can. And I say thoughtfully because, for example, clearly the Arab Spring was a regional phenomenon, but the reality is that each country has experienced the Arab Spring individually. And if we're going to be truly effective, we have to look at each country separately as we develop our policies and programs. And we recognize that we still have to address the underlying causes of high unemployment, and recognize that the economic situation has, in many cases, gotten worse as transitioning countries struggle under the weight of change. And that's part of the challenge of transition in many cases. Just to give you a couple of specific examples now of what our programs are doing in some of these countries. In Tunisia, we signed a quite significant loan guarantee agreement that allowed the Tunisian government to borrow $485 million from international markets. And this support helped the government to provide its citizens with critical services, including job skills training, educational programs that help banks provide financing for small businesses. At the same time, and so that's a big financial agreement that's sometimes difficult to translate in immediate practical terms to people, but it's what allowed the Tunisian government to be able to do much more for its people. At the same time, we at USAID are directly implementing an information and communications technology project that will address, we hope, many of the underlying causes of Tunisia's high unemployment rate, especially its high youth unemployment rate. And that project is intended to focus on increasing and diversing entrepreneurship for small and medium-sized business development in the ICT sector, and involves training young Tunisians for jobs, specifically training young Tunisians for jobs, and focused on reducing ICT sector policy and regulatory growth constraints. In Lebanon, we have a program that is specifically looking at tackling the skills mismatch and helping prepare young people for the local job market. And we've had a lot of help from Congress on this because it looks at, it's a scholarship program that's aimed at the 3 big private universities in Lebanon. And it is a full ride for the most economically disadvantaged of Lebanon's most meritorious students. And to qualify for it, you obviously have to demonstrate significant financial need, but you also have to be willing to major in areas that the country most needs. So you have everything from business administration to nursing to petroleum studies these kids are majoring in. And you also have to participate in community service projects while you're at the university. University. And I've met with the students who are in this program at one of the universities. They have an amazing bond between and among them. They're also an amazingly diverse group of students. More than half of them are women. They have not, for the most part, they come from families where they're the first in their families to go to university for education. And you just know that they are students who are going to do amazing things in their futures. And they're also coming out with job skills training and prepared for jobs that the country needs, which is different than how others are applying into university. In Egypt, we are establishing career development centers in 14 of Egypt's 17 public universities. And again, they're specifically targeted at matching and preparing students better for getting out into the job market that Egypt has, matching up in those job centers, matching up with Egyptian companies and multinationals to find out what they need, find out how students are not prepared for them, and to go into those job centers to help students prepare themselves for that in ways that they are not currently prepared for the jobs that are out there, and to try to do a better match of the skills, and then work with the university as well to help them up their preparation of the students. When I was last in Egypt at the end of August, we had a very good launch of that program with the new Minister of Higher Education. The discussion was very promising in a lot of ways, including his very deep enthusiasm for the program, his specific and very, let's say, well-deserved for us kind of citation to us to ensure that we added to the program English language training across the board in all the sectors, and regardless of where the programs were and what level of education, vocational or not. And it was a fair admonition to us that hadn't been in place already in the program, and that's why it's a well-deserved admonition to us. And I thought it was a very good sign that he was looking into the university was having. Just one last program that I want to point out to you that we've been working on in West Bank. And again, it's a program that we have an incredibly entrepreneurial staffer in our mission in West Bank, Gaza, who is himself, I would say, an expert on finding and leveraging opportunities, which I think so much of this is about. And this particular program is working. It's called the Compete Project, but that's not so important, the name of it. But it works to look for opportunities for small and medium-sized Palestinian businesses to access markets and meet requirements in markets that they might not otherwise be able to do, or not to do a certain amount of matchmaking, I would say. And so there's one particular business there that I'd like to mention because it's a large frozen food processing company. And so that makes it, however unlikely, they happen to be known for making amazing French fries, not that I'm in the business advertising. But it's a business in Hebron, and the reason I bring it up is because they were previously bringing in potatoes from outside of the West Bank. The youngest generation of that family felt that there was a better way of doing business, was sure that there must be some Palestinian businesses. There are so many farmers in the West Bank, there must be another way of doing this that was possible, and being able to use more internal Palestinian vegetables. The company has amazing freezer capacity. I know I've toured them. They're unbelievable in terms of the volume, the depth, and the quality of them. But no one in the West Bank could grow the right kind of potatoes. And it turns out Idaho potatoes are very special for a number of reasons, to be able to freeze. And so we were able to work with some very entrepreneurial West Bank farmers further in the north. The younger generation of the family around Hebron, willing to be patient in finding the right kind of potato that could be grown. Again, some pretty entrepreneurial younger farmers in the West Bank. It's a different way of doing business. End result is that this family business is now employing a whole lot more people, linked up with some businesses, some farmers that were much more entrepreneurial than others were willing to be in the northern West Bank. There are a lot more jobs as a result, much higher volume of for the company. I would also note that the company is now expanding to the Gulf in terms of their exports. They were already exporting to other places, but increasing. They were primarily a West Bank business, doing quite well. But it's their younger generation that's looked both to do more internally and to do more externally, and pushing the older generations within the family business. Quite grateful for the very strong business that has been handed down to them, but pushing the boundaries of that business. And AID in this case has been a little bit the leveraging factor. So I would, in the matchmaking factor, in terms of bringing the businesses together, which is, I think, in a number of ways, how I would see us throughout the region. That yes, we put in, and are willing to put in a significant amount of development assistance writ large, but we work best when we're working with others on the ground and internationally to look to make things work. There are a number of very committed young people throughout the region, and we are fortunate to be able to partner with them. And with their leadership and with our partnership, we're committed to look for opportunities and to help them realize the opportunities that they are committed to moving forward.
Mara, thank you very much. I think it gives us some great insight into what USAID is doing right now in terms of matching, in terms of program development. I think it appears that we may be temporarily offline from Alanoud, who, as I mentioned, is in the Gulf today. So what I'd like to do in the interim is actually turn here to Tariq and now invite Tariq and Yusuf from Silatech from Qatar to speak about some of the innovations and programs underway from Silatech and from other actors working in the space across the region. Thank you, Tariq, for beginning.
Thank you, Matt, for the invitation to be with you today. And thanks to IISS for organizing this event, where I think we're discussing new critical policy development and also security questions for the region, the Arab world, especially the countries that are going through the transition. Rather than share with you an inventory of what's Silatech, let me maybe try to frame the discussion building on what has already been said, to contextualize.
Tariq, I think if you could just speak a little loud, I think we'll be fine.
Speak loud. That's never been a problem. So,
no need to be modest here, so I'm on friend.
Thank you. Rather than share with you detailed examples of what Silatech and others are doing, I'd like to frame the discussion a bit more, hopefully to provide a context for understanding why is it that we're doing certain things and unable to do other things, and what are the possibilities now at this particular moment in the transition in the region. I think the first thing I would note in my opening remarks is to sort of go back a little bit, take you a few years ago, in the context of discussions that were taking place in this very city. Discussions about the scope for reform, the scope for both economic, political reform, and a conventional wisdom that had come around to recognizing the need for not just piecemeal reforms, but comprehensive batteries of changes to policies, to practices on the public policy side, but also on the legal and private sector, educational practices, a host of things that were at the heart, perceived to be at the heart of problems of unemployment. So if the primary concern for all of us is unemployment and problems connected to it, perhaps with lack of access to credit markets, limited employability of graduates, a failing system of marriage markets as well, a host of development indicators. Certainly the unemployment one is the most serious of those, facing large chunks of Arab youth, especially youth who happen to have come of age in the last 10, 15 years. Then the conventional wisdom, just a few years ago, suggested what we really needed was to tackle a lot of these big structural problems. Anything else you did was really temporary, piecemeal, unlikely to get you to where you ought to go. Assuming, of course, that what we wanted to have, the vision we all saw for the region was a vision of a prosperous, dynamic, open, confident set of economies that were linked with the outside world and where young people would thrive, not on the basis of state support, or employment, but their own empowerment and integration into the economic process. Well, the Arab Spring did, in fact, in my view, create the foundation for the realization of these changes, these reforms. At least they created the possibility for this to happen, partly because the structural changes required necessitated both economic and political changes, all of which would make it possible for one to imagine or to realize the vision that I just shared with you just a minute. But here comes the catch, and I think this is where we did not think ahead of ourselves. We didn't have any reason to think. We were very pessimistic just a few years ago. We didn't think the Arab Spring would arrive. We didn't prepare ourselves for the day after. We assumed dictators are removed, the political space is open, economic reform is going to be possible, and we're going to be able to do a lot of catching up quickly. I think the biggest surprise for all of us has been the transition, the length of the transition, the time where the political space would remain vulnerable, social peace would be largely absent, policymakers would remain lacking in a lot of confidence, and where a lot of the blueprints for the change are not going to come together in a political space where inclusion in the decision making is going to be paramount and where expectations for short-term change are intense. I think this is the part where many of us had sort of not prepared for, didn't expect, didn't foresee. And so we face the dilemma that we're in right now. Until things settle, while we're waiting for the political transition to really provide for the kind of discussions, internal debates, and the emergence of new conventional wisdoms within these societies, ones that would favor employability, limited public sector involvement, that would favor entrepreneurship, that would favor placing value on education for work, and that would provide access to markets in a fair and a transparent way for youngsters. Until that happens, really, I think the question we're all facing now, and I think we'll face it for the next few years, what do we do meanwhile? We're talking about 2 to 3, 4 years where the political space has not settled, policy doesn't have a lot of traction, there's no conventional wisdom, and yet youth unemployment, youth employability, and a lot of other indicators associated with youth, in my view, would either deteriorate or would continue to fall way short of expectations at a time when expectations for change and immediate change are incredibly intense. I think this is where a lot of what USAID and SILATEC and others are trying to do maybe fits in and can provide a partial answer. A lot of what we're doing, a lot of the examples listed earlier, a lot of SILATEC is doing in many other organizations, is really trying to populate this open opportunity, limited space for engagement, with practical solutions. We're not trying to provide long-term blueprints for change. We're experimenting with changes in policies, maybe limited changes in policies, and with introductions of new programs. And there are a number of areas where you see a lot of this happening. I call this social innovation, if only because the people engaged in it don't necessarily always know one another. This is not systematic. This is not led by the state. It's not led by the outside world. It's people who see eye to eye, private sector individuals, some public sector officials, a lot of NGOs, people with ideas who are bringing these ideas in the space that youth can thrive in. A lot of work we're observing is happening in the space of skills development and vocational training. I could list a whole number of programs that are actually experiments that we're making, things that might get us eventually to that promised land if a lot of these experiments take place. We see a lot in the service-based learning and experience building experiments taking place. A lot of emphasis and investments being put in facilitating job information and career guidance. These are new concepts in the region. These are new innovations. These are things that for just 10 years ago were largely absent. Now many groups, many organizations are championing them. Maybe the last two areas are the ones where you hear a lot of noise. A lot of talk on entrepreneurship training, entrepreneurship awareness, introduction of entrepreneurship into classrooms. A lot is happening in this space. And increasingly more and more on access to finance through micro-based, a lot of ICT-led innovations that try to sort of bypass the banking system or provide access to credit for young people going into labor markets. And finally, a lot in the space of support for small and medium-sized enterprises, certainly areas that the US government has backed. I have nothing but the utmost enthusiasm and support for all the work that's been done in this space. Partly because I recognize that this is the only thing you can do now. And you need to do it because very little of it has happened in the past. And this is what the political space and the economic policy can accommodate and support. Social innovations led by multiple actors, public, private, NGOs, international, filling the vacuums, bringing in new experiments in a region where everything, until just a few years ago, had to be government stamped, had to be government run, or had to be government blessed. So I bless and I support, and I'm happy to be a part of this movement, is only because I recognize that it is providing and forming an important short-term goal. But these experiments, led by us, many others, including a lot of the USAID programs, are not a substitute for what has to happen eventually. And in fact, we can, through these important short-term interventions and innovations in policy and programs, maybe help shape the long term by demonstrating what works, building new practices, getting people to work with one another, and developing a local body of knowledge based on experience within the countries on actually what works in the development space and how it should happen, and how you can take a program from Morocco and duplicate it perhaps in Tunisia and scale it up in other countries and use technology and localize a lot of these interventions, maybe by the replication exercise and the scaling up exercise and the demonstration exercise. You can in fact create enough of accumulated experience, shape expectations, and eventually shape the long-term informed projects, which have to happen. Because one has to recognize that while a lot of these individual interventions and policies and programs can provide results and can provide, in many ways, a lot of important positive effects, the underlying sources of youth unemployment, youth exclusion, I would argue, is the structural foundations of societies and economies and politics. That is where we ultimately have to focus. That's what we have to get to. And if it's going to take social innovation now to help get us there and build confidence amongst the policy community, demonstrate on the ground how things happen, I think what we are doing is the right answer. It certainly is the only thing we can do at a moment where the transitions haven't settled and policymakers have not accepted any blueprint, let alone a blueprint that is largely exported from abroad and has very little organic foundation in what people do on the ground.
That's great, Tarek. Thank you very much for setting the scene, for giving us some context for the unique challenge that is facing the Arab Spring countries and many of the social innovations underway. This challenge, however, as well noted, is not necessarily limited to just the countries and the economies which are undergoing transitions at this point. And this is a wider macro challenge which is impacting other regions of the world and other parts of the Arab world. Alanoud, I'd like to please, now that you're back with us, invite you to give some brief remarks and to perhaps set the context, more broadly speaking, for the youth unemployment challenge in the Arab world, and also to speak to the case of some of the GCC countries and the challenges which those economies are facing. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthew. First, I'd like to speak about the issue of youth unemployment within the global context. And this issue, I'd like to make more people I'd like to share the narrative here, because our Electoral Foundation unemployed of the year, and it talks about 100 million people now between the ages of 30 and 15 across the globe who are seeking employment. So this segment of the population represents about 6% of the total human population, according to the latest statistics by the IMF. So we're talking about 1.2 billion. This becomes especially acute in areas like the Arab world, where the youth bulge phenomena is much more apparent. So a greater swath of the population than the average is within this youth bracket, 25 and under. So this creates continuous job provision pressure on various countries across the world. And we've seen austerity protests in Japan, in the US, the USAID. We can consider it part of the Occupy Wall Street movement as a youth unemployment issue, and elsewhere. And I'd like to focus on Europe a little bit, because the issue has become especially acute in Europe. And I think because of its ties to the MENA region, it has had an effect, especially on that region, with the continuing of the Eurozone crisis. So this issue has been greatly affecting the policymakers in Europe as they struggle with the Eurozone crisis. 1 in 5 youths in Europe right now is unemployed. And there's some 13 billion euros now that are being poured into programs similar to the ones that Dr. Tariq and Mara spoke about, to try and engage these youths in initiatives and vocational training programs to help them enter the workforce. The problems with finding jobs for young people are similar across the globe. High school and university graduates tend to lack the work experience that is sometimes more necessary for employees, especially when there are a credit crunch going on than simply a degree. The side effects of youth unemployment are also relatively uniform across the globe. So what you have as a result of youth unemployment are higher depression rates, increased immigration, decreased birth rates, and generally a rise in crime, violent activity, and anti-establishment movements such as protests. Now, we can't look at the protests or the austerity protests in Europe and the ones in the Arab world as being exactly the same. But since we've been talking a great deal about Tunisia this panel, the add-on effects of the crisis in Europe were especially acute in Tunisia. Tunisia was a back factory, if you like, to many of the Mediterranean countries. And the crisis in Europe caused a lot of factories in Tunis to shut down and tens of thousands to be unemployed. What makes the situation in the Arab world markedly different is that Arab youth often lack the freedom of expression, and there is often as well the presence of of a corrupt or oppressive leadership that is unwilling or unable to instigate the necessary changes to rectify this issue, or in some cases, it just moves at a much slower pace to placate this movements on the streets. So we have a problem in the GCC, and I don't know how many of you are aware of the latest protests we've had here in Kuwait. On Sunday, we had the largest march in the history of Kuwait, and this was a reaction to the emir changing the laws to do with voting districts. But it was mostly motivated by young people who are not gainfully employed. So even if they are, engaged in government jobs, and this is the case in most of the GCC. The GCC governments are employees of somewhere between 90 and 82% of the national population. But what happens is that a lot of that is mass unemployment, as it's part of the patronage agreement between ruler and ruled, that the government would provide jobs for nationals. So what you have is a great swath of the young population, and here in Kuwait, 60% of the national population is under the age of 25, so it's actually more acute than in other places. So they have time on their hands, and they are looking for a cause, if you like. In Kuwait, we don't have a resources issue like they did elsewhere. This is a relatively democratic place compared to the rest of the GCC and the Arab world, and yet these young people took to the streets. They endangered their lives and the lives of others. Even after the protest was officially disbanded, they were still outside one of the main arteries, refusing to go home because this is an exciting adventure for them, and they don't have enough to occupy their time. So what happens is that you have a dangerous mix of bicultural anxiety and a culture that glorifies this type of martyrdom, if you like, this type of self-sacrifice. And this really feeds into a youth culture, and it can be exploited by politicians and others for their own political ambitions. And this is part of the thing that we're going to face increasingly as there are more and more pressures on governments to provide jobs for young people, and the mechanisms in place to deal with it are failing to occupy enough of the necessary job creation pressures. So Kuwait, we have a unique setup here that's very different from DC. We have representation without taxation. So what we have is a relatively image middle class has a sense of entitlement when it comes to consuming politics as well as everything else. So as these repercussions of Arab Spring movements and the problem of finding gainful youth employment come head to head, we're going to see, I think, more of these clashes in the GCC. So what the governments have decided to do collectively through the GCC Council in 2005 was that one of the ways that they were going to combat this was to move away from, importing foreign labor and trying to get the national workforce to fill in some of the gaps in the labor market. Now, we have a problem here with work ethic, and we have a problem with the lack of a skill set. So what these governments have instigated are these nationalization programs to try and force the private sector to take on more of the burden. And in some ways, hopefully, this will at least give us the statistics necessary to understand the magnitude of this problem, because we have a statistical transparency problem here, especially when it comes to populations and demographics. But what we've done recently is that it made people more aware of the need for vocational training, which I think Dr. Youssef was talking about, the need to bring the national population of the GCC up to a more globally competitive standard so that they can fill in some of the positions in the private sector and take the burden off of the governments. But I think increasingly, as young people watch the developments happening across the region and elsewhere, and demands for gainful employment and a more concrete sense of identity clash with this newfound appetite for taking to the streets, we're going to see further, further strains on governments in the GCC to provide greater job opportunities and greater benefits to placate the young people.
Alanoud, thank you very much for illuminating some of the challenges of the GCC, particularly those challenges around governance and employability. For the sake of time, I'm going to now actually turn to the audience because I know we'd love to hear from some of you. If I could please just remind you once again that we are on the record, and if you could please state your name and affiliation before asking your question, and please just try to keep your question brief, and I just ask our speakers to please try to keep your answers brief so we can cycle through as many as possible. Thank you. Sir, right there. This gentleman here in the third row.
Can you hear me?
A little louder, please.
I enjoyed listening to the
Sir, if you could please just state your name.
Okay,
So
Oda Aberdeen. I'm a consultant on Middle East business. I enjoyed listening to the three of you. You have made some great remarks. But as I look at this issue of youth unemployment, there are three basic problems that we need to address. We not address these issues, we'll be limping along. One, you need an education that produces relevant skills and talent, that will produce entrepreneurs. And if you can't produce entrepreneurs in the short term, eternally, you may have to import them. Two, you have the issue of crony capitalism, where basically there is no trickle-down impact on the local population. The few benefit from crony capitalism. It doesn't reach the wider population. And when you talk about crony capitalism, you're really talking about merit. Thirdly, you need to create a culture of venture capitalists. There is plenty of money in the region. The banks are very little. You have very wealthy individuals. The governments have billions of dollars. But you hardly find Arabs who are willing to bet on young Arabs who want to venture capital. I like to see the day when Arabs will have an Arab military. And in this country, the most significant companies that have been created in the last 4 years were funded by American investors, entrepreneurs. And this, I don't see. I find that those who have money want to invest in real estate.
Sir, if you have a question, so if you can please just direct your question. Thank you.
My question is, or my comments are, these are the key issues that have to be addressed. Otherwise, we're really just going around and not addressing the fundamental issue of creating jobs.
If Dr. Tariq and Mara, would either of you would like to respond?
Oh, yes, it's good to see you after a long time. And I think we agree on the blueprint, or we agree on what needs to happen. What we were trying to highlight, I think, myself, Mara, and Alanoud, was what are we doing about it? And I think some of what we're doing actually is addressing precisely the concerns. For example, on education. Now, if you can get me a mandate from a Minister of Education to wholesale restructure curricula, we could actually make a lot of progress in dealing with that problem. But that mandate is not coming. It's not coming anytime soon. What you're left with are these experiments and innovations we're introducing, whereby we're providing add-ons to the existing curriculum, taking kids out of school and doing additional things with them. In fact, a lot of what we're doing on the micro lending and access to credit is trying to tackle the problem of crony capitalism, because it's centered at the top and it's focused on access to power at a very high level. You know, access to microcredit and access to savings funds, and these are actually very equality building inventions or innovations in that part of the world. And finally, I'd say the culture of venture capital is going to hopefully emerge as a result of this. What I agree with you, though, is on the collective responsibility of individual actors in this open space now in the region. The collective responsibility on all of them to actually contribute and work with others and bring knowledge that works. I'll share with you, forgive me, Matt, for maybe spending a minute on where I see both the potential of some of the things we're doing, but also the limitations. I went to Amman just a little over a week ago, spoke at an MIT business competition. I was blown away by the quality of proposals and youngsters with ideas who can actually that can become commercial, be viable, with support. They're getting all the mentoring, all the training. They're putting together fantastic business proposals. We've invested a lot in entrepreneurship, and I think we should be doing more of this in the future. But here's the problem. And many of them would actually be the first to recognize it and now express concern about it. For every 100 of these projects that emerge, or youngsters that have ideas, there's only 1 or 2 investors that's willing to take a chance on these youngsters. The response so far in the region has been to rely on these big funds that have been built up, including with the support of USAID and our own investments, that would invest in SMEs. These big funds are tackling big companies. There's a whole space in the middle that nobody is actually doing anything. Now, we've identified it here. Let us build these coalitions, and that is, I think, the social innovation we need to build this employability and entrepreneurship bottom up. I don't want to wait, and I will not wait for governments or high net worth individuals to come and do this. I would like to work with social actors who recognize the problems and realize that if all we do is train people to become entrepreneurs but don't provide them with the funding, we will be creating a generation of frustrated entrepreneurs who will become even more angry in the future. And we'll give entrepreneurship and self-empowerment a bad name. That is the flaw in social innovation, unless you create the whole ecosystem. We need to be working together across the board with other people like you to make this possible. Otherwise, as I said, that we have the potential, but these things are not enough.
And I'll just comment briefly, because I agree with everything that Rick said, but also that we have, and I won't take the time to do it, but we have multiple examples of work we're doing in each of the areas that you mentioned. Education, I only mentioned the scholarships in Lebanon. We have them all over. I only mentioned the job skills training centers in Egypt. We have them in multiple places, and we have multiple other training programs also. But in the need for venture capitalism, in the trickle-down areas, just a couple examples. We help with loan, not just USAID, other parts of the U.S. government. OPEC is working on loan guarantee facilities that help to get out that bank money, small and medium-sized enterprises. We at USAID partner with them to do the technical assistance to help those small, medium-sized enterprises and help the banks to do better in how they get out that money. A couple great examples of, I would say, maybe it's the help of the diaspora community in getting more of that venture capitalism in, but just 2 great Palestinian examples in the ICT world. There's a company up in Nablus called Infinite Tiers that I went to visit that competes, and they made both Infinite Tiers and iConnect. iConnect is a company out in Ramallah, also Palestinian American, Palestinian Canadian, both of them have both. are competing for the best and the brightest from Palestinian universities in software development, and both have incredible expansion plans. Both tell me they're the hottest places to go from the Palestinian universities, and both have great recruitment. And I've seen the young people who are working there. And I recognize on the websites that I shop on, a lot of the software development that one of the companies does. I'm not going to say which one, will get upset with me. But so somebody is investing in those companies. And someone, or multiple people are investing in those companies, because I've watched how they've grown just over the couple of years that I've been back and forth with them. And I know at least one of them, it was a Palestinian and I'm sure international as well, venture capital company that partnered with them to invest. So yes, more of it needs to happen. Some of it is happening. And it's happening in multiple different ways. And so those are just a few examples. So we are part of it, but there's private-public partnerships, and much more of it needs to happen. I actually think the international community is a big part of needing to grow that as global community, and I think the younger generations do get it. The Al Salam frozen food company was one example of that. They are working to convince the older generations and their family, but the company needed to start from somewhere, and in that case, it was handed down.
No one's arguing with the U.S. position. I think the U.S. is doing a great job, especially on education. And I was talking about the whole Arab region, where the Arabs have to take the lead role. We can't just wait for the U.S.
If everyone's doing it together, it's international.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to make time to cycle through a few more, so please brief questions and brief responses. Madam, in the second row here.
Thank you. Welcome to the Manpower Group. We have worked with Silotech in the past, and we have a program with USAID in Southeast Europe on youth development. I'm on the World Economic Forum on Global Agenda Council on Youth Economy. These are some of the most interesting comments that I have heard about this topic in the region. So, about these social innovation experiments, have you seen any of you, have you seen any that are really promising in the area of apprenticeships? Because we have seen that some countries and communities that are doing very well on youth unemployment and equalizing it with adult unemployment combine well the work experience with training. Are there some breakthrough programs that are promising that you think should stay after we exit this transition period?
That's for you, Tarek.
Yeah, maybe here I'm comment as a researcher. As I've transitioned from the academy to the real world, I've realized the limitations of everything I've studied before, talked and wrote about, and that has often led to a number of frightening realizations. One of them is the absolute frightening gap between what needs to happen and how much we know is happening on the ground. And maybe one way of conceptualizing this better is to say, we really don't know, in response to your question, what programs are out there, whether they've worked, and whether they're applicable to any other country. We don't. One of the things we're investing in right now is just building a culture, or they maybe like this word, a culture of monitoring and evaluation programs. Working with other NGOs that operate in this space to help them train themselves on evaluating their own work. So perhaps we can develop that body of knowledge, and one can have the answer eventually to a question that you so rightly posed, and I think is fairly legitimate. I'll share with you just one other frightening realization, as that sort of made my transition, not related to your question, but I think it's symptomatic of the general problem. I used to write a lot about SMEs and the need for SME development. SMEs would lead the way, they're the job creation engines. I thought I would find, as I began to tour the region, multiple funds, multiple pools of resources that have been put together in support of SME development, SME growth, SME, you name it. And the frightening realization is you could actually count on one hand the players in this region. And the pool of money that they've aggregated in this space over the last 10 years is probably not going to employ more than 20, 30, 40,000 jobs, tops. Hundreds of billions of dollars is going to be required just in this one space to actually experiment truly with SME development in the region where we're talking about 50, 60, 70 million jobs being needed. So knowledge, experimentation, like-minded people, there's a lot that can be done I'd say in a region where there's very little that has happened in the past for reasons that we all recognize.
We'll have time for one more question from the audience. This gentleman here.
Firstly, thank you very much. My name is George Mason University senior. I recently came back from Libya this past year, back in February. I was there for about a year helping revolution, both in the government and as well as the front line. What I've been seeing recently now, within just the last few months, is a lot of Libyan dissidents who grew up here, went to school here, graduated, are going back to Libya, or as well as Tunisia, Egypt, but going back to help, and somehow they're being pushed away or pushed aside. And I've seen NGOs also pushing them aside, trying to make a basis for the youth that are there now and trying to get them jobs. Whereas you have these people who somewhat had the experience, have been in internships. I myself have tried this many times when I was there, and it's always, okay, you've had your shot, you've had your chance, let's give these guys a chance. Whereas, we're going back for the same reasons all these NGOs are going to build up the country to help it out. If you guys could, it was mentioned briefly, if you guys could touch upon that.
Thank you. So your question, I think, is how do we leverage and integrate diaspora youth into the economic transitions?
Absolutely.
And question, Mara, would you like to share a few thoughts?
Sure. Because it's an interesting challenge because you have a tremendous skill set that is very very helpful. Actually, I have to say my rules of training was immediately helpful to a number of the things that we USG programmatically and our implementers on the ground might be working on as well. So we should talk. But it also is a challenge, and you can see for a country that has so many kind of immediate employment needs for folks who are there and have been there for a long time, and they need to be able to meet. And so figuring out how to sort through all of that is a tremendous issue. In a country like Libya, where they're trying to sort through so many different things at the same time, it's tough for you and your colleagues coming over to the States and end up being, sadly somewhat lower on the priority. I think that where you do have a leg up, and this may be not the kind of job hunting advice you're looking for, but stop. Honestly, is in the number, goes back to where I started, the number of different skills you bring to the table. So in things like there's a number of different international organizations that are over there like us and other countries who are there in assistance capacity. You guys have a home market, frankly, that you can go to that others on the ground may not. And so that's frankly some of what I would encourage in terms of places to look and opportunities that you have going in, and at least in terms of a place to start for job markets coming out, because there's clearly a transition phase for Libya. There are going to be international actors there and on the ground, and I know what we look for when our implementers look for going in. And what you've described about your background, the work that you've done there.
one final question, and this is a question for all three of you in 50 words or less. Are you optimistic about the future, and what are your closing thoughts? First to Alanoud, who's with us over satellite.
You want me to answer the question first? No, sorry, the line is cutting.
Sorry for the bad connection. I just said to briefly sum things up. If you have any closing thoughts, or if you want to share any hopes or optimism for the future, but please try to keep it to 50 words or less.
Well, I see a few things diversify our industries. The creative industries are relatively untapped. So there's a great opportunity there, but we have to change our mindset. And there was a lady there who asked about apprenticeship. You know, some of our youths have an aversion to working in manual labor, carpentry, masonry, etc. So these are all hopefully reached where we can get some gainful youth employment and engage young people in activities that are not so oil dependent.
Thank you very much, Mara.
I'd say given the amount of time I've spent in the Middle East, I'm never pessimistic. I'm careful about being optimistic. I'm always pragmatic and committed. I'd say committed and pretty clear-eyed, but committed to meet the energy and enthusiasm and vigor of the young people that I meet in every country that I go to, and to represent what the United States is committed to carrying through on what they're doing and on their expectations, which are significant, and on partnering up with the leadership of other countries throughout the world, including in that region, to be able to work to meet those expectations, because that's what we have to do, because it's in our interest to do it, and that's why I say I'm pragmatic about it. It's what we have to do for them and for us.
Thank you. And finally, Tarek.
I guess just very briefly, I started writing about the topic of youth unemployment a little over a decade ago. And back then, things looked already dire. And one labeled the state of affairs facing Arab youth as a state of crisis and exclusion. But it took a decade in a number of countries right now going through change, going a long, difficult process of transition for the possibility of change to emerge. During this period, problems became more complicated. Past inaction has overburdened now societies and policies with demand. And we also did not prepare for this moment. We did not prepare intellectuals, we did not prepare as policymakers, as policy analysts. We have also a lot of catching up to do. The NGO, public sector officials, private sector officials. And I think if the next 5 years are about creating the right foundations for long-term prosperity and long-term genuine reform of societies with the view to empowering young people, then a lot of this interesting thinking, a lot of the innovations, and a lot of the new experimentation has to happen now. I see a lot of it on the ground in almost every country I travel to in the region. I just don't see enough of it. There is a role for the US and for many other regions that have gone through similar problems in the past to help us here, share their experience, share their knowledge. But the heavy lifting all is going to be ours, and a lot of it is going to hopefully be with actors working across the region, working across sectors and various interests in this. This is not going to be, and maybe I'll just give myself an opportunity here to respond to my fellow Libyan. The process of change and reform is a process that's going to create winners and losers. Even within the same camp of revolutionary and those who led the process of change. That is part and parcel of managing the political space during this time. We just have to be aware of it, work around it. I think our responsibility to Libyans, to Tunisians, and to Egyptians is to actually provide them with what we see to be good practice, to put our own investments, our own organizations, and our own resources behind it. I remain hopeful. If we can get past the next 5 years, I think things would look very, very promising, and perhaps a dream of a more prosperous, stable, and empowered generation of Arab youth will be then realized.
Thank you, all three of you. Thank you very much to all of our guests. Thank you very much to Becca, to Randy, and to Barb Friedman for all of your support to make this particular discussion possible today.